Hello, this is a video that I made as part of a series on health promotion planning, and this particular video is intended to be an introduction to the concept of health promotion planning models, and also an introduction to some of those models, and then towards the end we'll pose some questions for you to think about when considering the use of models. This video is accompanied by some resources as well, which are intended for further reading and engagement, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's dive into the slides and think about health promotion planning models. Okay, so health promotion. First of all, we need to acknowledge what health promotion is and maybe what it isn't. I've covered that elsewhere in other videos. Excuse me, but you'll find definitions elsewhere, and you can see one on the screen at the moment. And then we have the classic definitions from the Ottawa Charter and the various World Health Organization global development conferences over the years, which have adapted the definition slightly. Health promotion and its context with public health, if there is a difference and where there's a difference, is a matter for broader discussion, as are the difference between health promotion and health education. Broadly speaking, most of the health promotion planning models that we're going to look at are around the concept of changing behaviour to achieve improved health outcomes. Some of them will deal more explicitly with face-to-face, one-to-one type interventions, whereas others will look more broadly. And as you might be aware, if you've studied the development of health promotion as a concept over the last few decades, you'll see that the shift from personal responsibility to broader infrastructure, wider socio-ecological cause and effect issues has embedded itself within health promotion. So these models can work across this full range of socio-ecological influences, but you'll find more about that elsewhere. In terms of a planning model, we'll look in a second at what we actually mean by a planning model, but the basic rationale for a planning model for a health promotion intervention is that there is lots of guidance around about the different actions that we should take when trying to plan a project, a scheme, an intervention, something that is hoping to ultimately lead to improved health and well-being. The concept is that if we have better planning for interventions, that we will have better outcomes, better programs, and this is born out of experience of many different researchers and practitioners, whereby well-meaning, well-intentioned, well-planned interventions can often be let down by missing some of the detail in the planning and not quite connecting with the problem in hand. There are a number of places where shortcomings can appear in terms of the planning of an intervention, and so the concept is that if we have a more strategic approach to planning, that we will cover our bases and nothing will fall through the gaps of the planning process. There's also a discussion around whether interventions are based on theory, and this interplay between research and published theoretical work and applied practice, and ultimately whether we can bring these two together and make the most out of the insight and the intervention development knowledge which is held within these two fields. Another key aspect in planning is that we are able to implement interventions which may have worked in one place in another place, and many of these models that we'll look at are designed to help us with that transition, that implementation in slightly different contexts. Key to many of these planning models is also the checking of assumptions. Many of us will have sat around before and thought that we knew what a health problem was all about and that we could come up with a solution for it, whereas within that whole process there are many assumptions that we're making, and we need to be more aware of our biases and the quality and volume of the information that is on our desk in order to help us plan these interventions. And some of these planning models are intended to make us question some of these assumptions and to try and help us avoid falling into the trap of making too many assumptions. Also, these planning models are there's a distinction between planning and evaluation, and the intention with good planning models is that we're able to strategically include evaluation of interventions so that we can develop them as we are in the process, but also so that when the process may have ended, should there be an end point, that we can contribute to the body of information so that others can take our learning and run with it and improve future interventions. So there are many rationales for better planning of health promotion interventions. What I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to think about what you know already about health promotion planning frameworks, models. So what I'd like you to do first of all is think about the task of developing a health promotion program. It might help you if you think about a particular population or a particular problem, but I'd like you to imagine you've been tasked with it, and then I'd like you to think about the stages through which you think that program would need to go from first thought process through to a nominal end point. Think about those stages. What I'd also like you to think about is the planning frameworks that you're aware of already. Many of you watching this video may have used a planning framework. Many of you may have used the different stages and not been quite aware that it was a planning framework. Many of you may look out and see many planning frameworks and be befuddled as to which ones are appropriate at which time. But what I'd like you to do is to have a think about which planning frameworks you're aware of as well. I'll leave you for a few seconds, but I recommend that you pause the video and spend some time thinking about this. Hello, back in the room, as they say. I hope you've given that some good thought, and as we move forwards I'll be able to introduce you into some of those planning frameworks, and we'll look at some of those stages. So we'll see how the reality matches up with your current experience and what we can add to that. In order to engage or to assess the field of planning models and to look at what's available prior to looking at the different models and thinking about what the strengths and weaknesses are of those models and where they might be applied, there's a couple of good papers that I'd like to introduce you to. The first paper is a fantastic overview of behaviour change interventions aimed at self-management for chronic illness. So this is not necessarily all health promotion interventions are exactly in that sweet spot of working with people that already have chronic illness, but many of the methods used in these intervention development schemes, models, have been used in broader health promotion community development work as well. And it's a fantastic paper for which reviewed the number of frameworks which are out there. You can see at the top of the screen that the most commonly referred to are the MRC framework for the development of complex interventions, intervention mapping, and then I'm going to look down a few and go for the behaviour change wheel. So these are three that I'm going to introduce you to a couple of those, and I will also talk about Precede-Proceed. But you can see on the left these are different models, and if we look at the purpose, and you just pause the video and have a look through, I'm not going to read all of them out, but it gives you slightly different take on the purpose of each one of these models. And there are many overlapping themes, but there'll also be some slight differences. I'll attach that paper to this video, and I encourage you to have a look at it and get a feel for the different models which are around. Similarly, fantastic paper by O'Cathane just recently as well, which produced a taxonomy of different approaches. So a slightly different approach, slightly more systematic, slightly different approach to looking at the landscape of planning models as well. But again, a really fantastic paper. And this time, they've been able to categorise in the title, a taxonomy. They've been able to look at the clear differences between some of these models and their purposes. And you'll also see, if you look at the paper, you'll see a very thorough examination of some of the strengths and the weaknesses, and a more detailed look at the purpose of the various different planning models. And once again, you'll see the Combi model, the intervention mapping, you'll see Precede-Proceed, and the MRC, amongst many other different models. What we're keen to look at is some of the themes across these models, and then also some of the differences. And these two papers are highly recommended for examining them. I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at some of these models now, just to give you a bit more detail on them. The Precede-Proceed model is a model which has been around for some time now, I think from almost 40 years now, and looks at the planning and then the delivery of interventions. The Precede and Proceed are an acronym which describes the model itself, with Precede standing for predisposing, reinforcing and enabling constructs in educational, environmental diagnosis and evaluation. I have to look at my notes. I can never remember what it's called. It's a very catchy acronym. And then Proceed stands for the policy, regulatory and organisational constructs in educational and environmental development. Broadly speaking, the Precede-Proceed model looks at four key phases, which are the identification of four key phases in the Precede model, which is the identification of the desired result, the epidemiological assessment, so what's the evidence out there, an educational and ecological assessment, so what's the landscape in this place where we want to work, and then looking at more broadly administrative and policy assessment. So it's trying to, again, question those assumptions and trying to prevent the planners from looking at just one part of the problem, and then in a worst case scenario, not fixing or addressing that part, but in a better model, actually addressing one problem, but it's only to be left relatively ineffective by failure to address more broad problems in that setting, perhaps. It starts to address implementation and the idea that once we have a plan for an intervention, we then need to think about how that's going to be implemented. Classically, in many of these models, we'll come up with a theoretical intervention which may involve, let's say, teachers in a school carrying out or delivering sexual health intervention, knowledge intervention. So there could be a fantastic book created which is given out to all teachers, loads of different resources, but yet the implementation phase is about how do we roll that out in more than one site, and how do we make sure that it stays true to its original aims. A different model, which is born out of the Precede-Proceed model, but takes it further on, and for the first part of intervention mapping recognises the benefits or the heritage that it has of Precede-Proceed. But intervention mapping is an approach which I'll give you some slightly more insight into, but we can start to see here where we've got different stages of the planning process. The first step looks rather daunting when it's titled Logic Model of the Problem, but effectively the process is to spend more time looking at the problem itself rather than making assumptions. It's about making sure we have enough evidence and we've left no stone unturned prior to starting to think about the potential intervention actions. Step 2 is about looking at those actions in the initial phase, deciding what we want to change, and then drawing up a logic model again, which sounds, again, daunting, but is about making sure we've got everything covered, making sure that we understand the process of change from one change into an outcome or a series of steps of changes. It also allows us to look at the complexity of a problem, what needs to change in what areas. Then we move on to looking at program design, program production, program implementation and evaluation. It's possible to have the idea, for example, of a website that might serve as an information exchange portal. And we could come up with really well-grounded theoretical content that is spot on, accurate, and well conceived, but yet we pass that project over to people which are charged with producing that website, that resource, and it's very possible that some of the original intentions and the quality and the choices that have been made in the design of the intervention can start to be lost when we have to add photographs to an intervention, and those photographs, for instance, might not be the representation of the priority population that might have been chosen by the original project designers. So we need to make sure that we've covered off every stage of the intervention design. If I was to pick a couple of stages in intervention mapping, this logic model of the problem, the concept of a logic model and the concept of looking at the problem in many of these models is that ultimately we're keen to improve quality of life. That would be our end point. The health problem in question would be the lung disease or the coronary disease, whatever the health problem itself, which is causing a decrease in the quality of life currently. We then quite quickly look at the behaviour of the at-risk group. So it could be that we were talking about lung disease for a health problem, and it could be that we're looking at a work-based problem and a practice amongst builders to operate and drill without wearing masks, for example, and that this is turning up in the health data in terms of lung disease further down the line. So the behaviour of the at-risk group, that refers to the things that the individuals in question, the priority, the target population, priority population, this is the behaviour that they have some control over. But as we know, when we look at socio-ecological models, the broader issues, that we've got the interpersonal social norms, we've got organisational constraints and influence, and then we go broader and we get out to public policy as well and rules and regulations. And so there are things which we could focus in on for that individual, and then there are more broader issues. Intervention mapping stresses the fact that we should look at all of these in this initial phase, even if we feel that we may not be ultimately going to try and change some of the others. We do need to focus on all of these to increase our own awareness of the fact that there is complexity in this health behaviour, and also to raise the potential, and that we can start to impact upon more broader determinants of a health behaviour. When we look at these behaviours of the individuals or the factors in the broader environment, intervention mapping then recommends that we look at the personal determinants. It highlights the fact that these broader factors do have individual personal determinants. So laws are made by people, and those people have their own personal determinants, and they will be different than the personal determinants of the people who make up the priority population. But that things like knowledge, the confidence, things that are held in more individually, although they're influenced by external factors, these are the personal determinants which start to make a difference between people that behave in one way and people that behave in another way. And intervention mapping, by starting off with the broad quality of life as an aim, moving backwards, gets us back to things that we think we can change in a health promotion intervention. Another advantage of a model such as intervention mapping would be in the way that we bring in theory into the development of our health promotion interventions. There's a real tension sometimes, or a potential tension between published theoretical interventions and their evaluation and dissemination as a concept that will work, and applied practice on the ground. Now, elsewhere, I've spoken about evaluation and the need to get more evaluation for these applied practice interventions so that we can share good practice and learn from the fantastic wealth of work that goes on. And similarly, we need to think about how much applied insight is and experience is built into these theoretical interventions. Some years ago, these two would be more separate, but lots of people have worked hard to try and to blend the two together and not have two extreme types of intervention taking place, and that they will both benefit from each other. So it's important. There are theories. There is evidence and suggestions that the more theory we can get into our health promotion interventions, the more aware we are of the theories and the insight that the research and the theories will give us in terms of the development of our interventions, the better they're going to be. Again, it's about questioning our assumptions, making sure we've covered all of our bases. Intervention mapping has a fantastic element to it, which is a great way of incorporating theories into our health promotion interventions. You can see here that at one point during intervention mapping, we start to think about what do we want to achieve? Do we want to increase knowledge? Do we want to change habits? Do we want to change attitudes and beliefs, social influence? So the first half of that table, in fact all of it, is about let me see what we got there. Yeah, so at the top we're looking at more individual level, and then as we progress down we're starting to look at more broader aims for change. Intervention mapping tries to lead us down the path of identifying what the problem is, thinking about the problem, value checking it with evidence and with priority population individuals and groups, and then to think what do we want to change, and then to draw on the theory which informs that area of change. So if we're trying to change habits, what does theory tell us is the best way to try and change habits with people, and how can we use that in our intervention? If we take number 6 on the table there on the list, which was changing social influence, here's an example of the different types of methods that we might choose, such as resistance to social pressure. Which theories give us insight into helping people resist social pressure? And then there's some definitions, and then we move on to, and then it gives some parameters, so it gives us some brief insight into what will work well and what might not work so well. This is an example of how we can build theory into our build better theory into our health promotion interventions. The next planning model I'd like to look at is the COMBI, or Behaviour Change Wheel, of Susan Mickey et al. At UCL. And many of you may have been familiar with this, which has gained popularity and has really grown and developed over the last 10 years or so, starting off as a review of all the behaviour change techniques that exist within a broader number of theories, and then progressing on to a method of observing interventions, and then value checking or assessing what techniques are actually in an intervention, what are the active ingredients within that intervention, and then further in time progressing on to a more robust and rounded structure for developing interventions, not just for evaluating them. This COMBI model has been applied in many settings, medical settings, community settings, and in work which looks at the individual, but also in work which tries to make changes to policy and more broader issues. We can see the relationship on the wheel between the policy categories, or the sources of behaviour, and the COM refers to the capability, opportunity, motivation in the middle, and talks about the basic, not basic, but the key factors that need to exist in terms of change. Do people have the opportunity to change in terms of social norms and social factors, as well as having the physical opportunity? Do they have the knowledge as well? And do they have the motivation? You can see as we look more broadly that we start to look at some of the intervention functions, the things that we can change. We can coerce people, we can have restrictions, and this is similar to the Nuffield model, Nuffield ladder of bioethics that you may have seen me talk about elsewhere. Then more broadly, on the outer ring, we look at some of those public policy changes that can wrap around a community and an individual and help make those the best choices, the healthy choices, the better choices. In terms of, so that would be the COM-B model and the behaviour change wheel. This has progressed over recent years into a more staged development plan, and this starts off, as we've seen with some of the other models, with the need to understand the behaviour to start with. What exactly is the problem? The amount of conversations that I've been part of where people will reel out the solution to a problem without necessarily fully understanding the theories around the evidence base, and without really talking to the people that this might be applied to. So it's important to cover all of our bases in that respect. Then we need to think about what we think the plan might be, spend time planning it, what's the most effective use of our resources, and then we need to plan the detail, and then think about how we're going to deliver the interventions. So I've only touched on 3 different models there, but you could see from the first few slides there are many different models. Nellie Hankonen and Wendy Hardeman have produced a really good chapter, and in fact there's a couple of good chapters in this recent book by Martin Hagger and colleagues, and they've just tried to distill down into some of the common themes across different planning models. So you can see here some of the themes that have already come up in this video so far. It's really important to spend time establishing what the problem is. It's really important to think about what the planned mechanisms of change are. What do we think we're going to do, and what are we trying to change? What's the theory that informs that? Where's our focus? Do we have to prioritize our focus, for example? Then we need to think about how we develop the actual intervention itself. Are there training materials involved for people? Are there materials that we're going to give out? How do we know, as soon as you have an intervention which involves more than the person or people that have developed it, you need to make sure that we have a sense of fidelity from the plan to the delivery. We need to make sure that everything's being delivered that's planned, and everything that's planned is being delivered. And so that nearly always involves some degree of training, whether that involves upskilling the delivery team to do things they're not familiar with or they might not have been trained to do, but also to make sure that we have a standard approach as much as possible to delivering whatever type of intervention it might be. We also need to think about evaluation and management. Many of these models will talk about evaluation as soon as possible, to think about evaluation as soon as possible. A common error in developing health promotion interventions is to dive in, deliver, get really excited and passionate about the intervention, and then to suddenly think that the money's going to run out and we need to somehow evaluate this and show evidence of effectiveness. It's really important to get that evaluation in early, and then to make sure that it's appropriate to all the stakeholders as well throughout. So I'd encourage you to have a look at this chapter. It's a really good way into looking at how we can develop the models of developing health behaviour interventions. So coming towards the end of this introduction, so many of these things I'll have spoken about already, but I'd just like to end with some overarching views. The idea of a health promotion planning model is that we take a systematic approach to the process of developing, devising, prioritizing, planning, and then delivering and evaluating a health promotion intervention. One of the concepts is that we try to make the most of the theory that's out there, so that we've got a well-planned intervention that is based on robust evidence elsewhere, in our population elsewhere. Most of the models really stress participation, and that's participation by the the priority population, the people that we want to work with, as well as other stakeholders as well. This could be commissioners, it could be delivery partners, it could be a research team, it could be the key team, should be the key team that are charged with implementing the intervention. I've said intervention too many times, I've worn it out. Another key aspect is that we question the assumptions, and we make sure that the things that we think are the problem, things that we think are the solution, are grounded in evidence. And we take this systematic approach. I've talked about the fact evaluation should be integrated, talked about the stakeholders, and I've also talked about that implementation needs planning. Often, and particularly, it's well stressed in intervention mapping that we go through a cycle of identifying the problem, planning a solution, developing a solution, thinking about evaluation all the way through, and then it's almost as if the process starts again because we have this package, this thing that we want to implement, but yet once we want other people to implement it, or once we want to get maximum impact from what we've developed, we then need to think about how are we going to get these other people to do this. One of the common themes that comes out from the models is about slowing down in the planning process. Intervention mapping in particular is the critiques of intervention mapping have said how it slows it down too much and is problematic in the amount of time that is needed to lay the foundations for the actual delivery of the intervention. And so somewhere at some point as practitioners and researchers, we need to be having discussions about the length of time needed to plan interventions, the resource needed to plan a good intervention, and having discussions about when we are at the right stage to actually deliver, and what do we know and what do we not know. I've been involved in interventions before which have their own many interventions which have their own timeline, their own momentum, and been involved in several big interventions which, because of the timeline, even though the timeline's been over several years for funding, that the time allowed for planning at the start is really very small compared to the intervention delivery time, and the amount of time and resource that's been put into an intervention is really deserved more planning time. So it's really important to think about this and build it into our projects. The details are important, which is linked to assumptions and things. In terms of resources to accompany this video, to allow you to dive deeper, I've chosen these 4 articles, a couple of which I've identified already. So there's the Charles Abraham and Nellie Hankonen chapters in Martin Hagger's book are really good. And then there's the other 2 articles, which are the taxonomies, the reviews of the different models which are available. And you'll see within those 2, you'll see different perspectives on some of those different planning models. Just above, you'll see there's a page that I've got on my website on intervention mapping, which includes a number of references referring to intervention mapping itself, but also has a section which includes a number of projects which have been developed using intervention mapping, but then have published those findings. You'll also see chapters in these other books above. And then I'd also point you towards the community toolbox. It's worth thinking that where these models come from. Some of these models are really obviously firmly grounded in the research and in the use of research funding and the development of very robust research outputs. Whilst they are also used in community settings, which are driven by applied practitioners rather than researchers, you'll see a different twist. And if you look at the Community Toolbox website, you'll get a slightly different perspective on some of these models. The 2 figures on the left, you see the one with the dots at the top and the one below are example tables from O'Cathane, and the top one, although you won't see the detail, shows many of these models and how they include different stages of that planning process, which I think is a really useful diagram. And then the lower one is just a sample diagram, sample image from their comparison of the strengths and weaknesses of different models. So I'll point you towards that reading, and accompanying this video I'll post those readings, and I'll also post a series more on health promotion planning models. There's a few extension questions on the board there, and if you're looking to further your thinking on critiquing different health promotion models and trying to choose which ones to use and what the differences are between them, then I'd encourage you to look at some of these questions. And apart from that, that's my last slide, and I'll point you towards all the other resources as well. I hope you found this useful as an introduction to different planning models, and I hope you enjoy reading some of those publications that I've pointed towards. Thanks for watching. Take care.